Hi, this is Matthew with Retro Edge Tech, and I want to do a follow-up video to something that I just published a few days ago. I got some great response and comments to the YouTube video that I posted. So down in the comments, one of the commenters named Philip asked some great questions, and we had a few kind of follow-up questions and talked about what then became this blog post that I published on my website, retroedge.tech. So just walk you through some of that conversation about, in the questions were, hey, why did you choose the Optiplex for having Alpine Linux servers that separate out the services instead of having them all on one Dell PowerEdge server? So why separate them out to separate PCs and instead of using containers on one machine? And then that's the PC versus a single board computer like the Raspberry Pi. So just want to go through those questions in this blog post that I wrote concerning those. Some pretty interesting stuff if you're into PCs, if you're interested in Linux, and some of the decisions that I made or am making, because I haven't finished this project. I'm just getting started. And in the project is to take a server that I currently have, a Dell PowerEdge, that has some containers on it and a number of services that I use in my home office work environment. And to separate those out into 4 separate machines, probably 4, that'd be 3 or 4 for sure, possibly more. And then so that each service, each thing that I'm running, so a backup server, a server that I have my images on for CloneZilla, a Nextcloud server, and some other things as well. So each one of them is in a separate computer PC instead of them all running on one larger server separated out by containers, or sometimes not separated out, and that's sometimes the issue. So hey, thanks for watching. We'll get into it. I just wanted to say, hey, I've got an email newsletter. Later on, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the store. If you sign up for the email newsletter, if you're interested, later on, I'll be doing a giveaway of a significant coupon for a discount on my online store that sells things like Dell Optiplex and other PCs. So I'll just go through and kind of put this out and read through some of Philip's questions, starting with, have you calculated how much more you're going to spend on electricity? So this is one machine versus multiple machines. Dell PowerEdge is fairly noisy. I actually have the tower version of a PowerEdge, and it has quieter fans than the rack mount server would. It's a lot quieter than that, but it's still pretty noisy, and the fan runs loudly all the time, and it's definitely noticeable to me, but not nearly as bad as a rack mount PowerEdge server would be. The rack mount systems take a lot of power. I have not tested how much power my current Dell PowerEdge is using. So that's an interesting question, and I would like to know the answer to that. I think I'm going to buy one of those meters and do some tests. I don't have it yet, but I'd like to. And I haven't calculated the difference on the power consumption that one of the small form factor Dell Optiplex computers that I'm going to be using. I'm going to use a small form factor Dell Optiplex 3010 computer, and I'm going to use 4 of those. I know for sure that one will take a lot less than the PowerEdge will, but I don't know if it's a quarter of the consumption. My guess is going to be more like a third of the consumption or something like that, at least a half. So, if I run 3 of the smaller Optiplexes, my guess is that's going to probably be a similar power consumption to the one PowerEdge. But I might be completely wrong. That's a guess. So Philip asks, have I calculated how much more I'm going to be spending on electricity? I haven't. I'd like to, but haven't yet. It's a good question. But even if the separated computers ended up taking significantly more electricity, I'm still planning on moving to separating my services out two separate computers instead of having them all on one machine. This gets a little bit into containers. Certainly the trend for at least the last 5 years has been, and before that it was virtualization, but in the last 5 years, definitely the trend in IT is containers. Containerization like Docker. We have, instead of having separate machines or separate virtual machines, you have these containers that you can isolate software in. And that way you can have, say, 20 different services all isolated in their own container. It's kind of like a pretend computer, but more slimmed down than that. You don't have to emulate the whole thing for a virtual machine. It's just in a container. So you get like 20 of them, and that I am currently using containers on my Dell PowerEdge. So definitely get that. And yes, if you were running lots and lots of services, you could containerize it and put it all on one machine or a couple machines and greatly reduce the cost of both size of the space that those computers take up and the power consumption. So if you're in a professional environment where you need to squeeze every bit out of the equipment that you have, it makes sense to containerize in certain circumstances. That's not my circumstance, and I do want the simplicity of having one service per machine. Mostly. I mean, there might be a little bit of overlap with some very, very simple things, but for the most part, each machine has a separate task. That way, if a power supply fails or a drive fails or something like that, my entire office infrastructure doesn't go down. So I do want that redundancy. So that's the, what would it make more sense to go to the container route? I've described in some cases it does make more sense. In some cases it doesn't. In mine, it's a preference. And if I had a spare machine that I would only plug in if the main one failed, well, then I have to work, I have to basically have everything ready in that spare machine, and then also have a way to quickly sync the data to it as well, or have the data stored somewhere else for then that second machine to be able to get the data from. Well, right then you have some kind of network attached storage. Well, that's a separate thing. If you have all your data in that network attached storage, and if that fails, so I'm trying to simplify things by, hey, this machine does this, and I know exactly where all the data for that thing is. Another machine does this, I know exactly where all the data and everything is for that. Same, and with other services as well. So that way, if there's a problem, I know exactly where to deal with it. And that problem affecting that particular machine, software, hardware, whatever it would be, isn't going to affect the other machines. And I don't get downtime of everything. I only have limited, segmented downtime. So I've also had just a few bad experience with Docker containers in the past. It's just complicating things and making it difficult to understand how the server is set up, where the data is. And since my goal is simplicity, there's no need for me to separate services into Docker containers, as my separation is already physical machines. So having a spare computers set up with all those services could work, but I'd just rather have everything running and my backup server be one of those things, and I can easily understand straightforward what's going on. So here's where it gets interesting with both the question about the kind of computers I'd like to use, as well as comparing significantly different architectures. And it is true that some of the services that I might want to run would run fine on something like a single board computer, Raspberry Pi. So here's Philip's question, or questions that are related. Why did you choose the Dell Optiplex instead of a low-cost single board computer like a low-end Raspberry Pi, which have less moving parts, so doesn't have a fan that it's going to break, and it dissipates less heat. It's not going to, it's going to use less energy, doesn't have as many moving parts, going to get less hot? Is it because you can get your Optiplexes for free or really dirt cheap? Good question. Or do you really need an x86 architecture for your experiments services? So it's a great comparison, comparing essentially a PC versus the Raspberry Pi or ARM-based computers, or kind of Intel x86 64-bit versus the ARM of the Raspberry Pi and the trade-offs there. So I'll just kind of get into some of the things using my backup server as an example. For some of my services, like a PC, like the Dell Optiplex, is going to be a better fit than the Raspberry Pi. I'm going to stress here, it could be any PC. It doesn't have to be a Dell Optiplex. A lot of times you might have a spare PC that's just lying around, and that's kind of where I'm going with this as well, is that this can show, I'm showing a use case for older PCs that may have been retired from other use, but are still incredibly useful. So here's why the Dell Optiplex is a better fit than the Raspberry Pi for this, say, the backup PC example. I will be using backup PC to back up other servers and workstations. For a backup server, at least 1 terabyte of storage is needed, and I'm probably going to go with a 2 or a 4 terabyte storage, probably one drive. I will be using a 3.5-inch SATA hard drive. The Raspberry Pi doesn't have SATA ports. And while there are ways to connect a hard drive to a Pi, the output through the Pi with USB is going to be a lot slower, and also the processing speed and throughput through all that is going to be slower. So backup PC, the backup server software that I'm going to be using, also compresses the backed up data, which takes significant CPU resources. The Pi would struggle to complete that compression for the backup in a timely manner, and it's even likely that the Pi would take more than 24 hours to compress backups for more than 5 machines, which is a serious problem if you want daily backups. If the compression operation is going to take longer than the time period that you want between backup snapshots, then that's a problem. So the Pi is going to struggle both through for the throughput to the hard drive, and has limitations, like you'd have to use some kind of USB to SATA adapter, and it's also going to have problems with the computations, for example, for compression on any kind of sizable amount of data and backups. So while the Pi is cheaper than the Optiplex, I looked at a Raspberry Pi, just for the Raspberry Pi 4, our current generation base model, you're looking at about $50 to get it shipped to you. And that's certainly cheaper than buying a PC. And even the older, say, Raspberry Pis, like the first gens, and even that, to buy used, you're still going to be paying some money, $25, $30. Yes, that's incredibly cheap for what it does, and there's lots of fun things that you can do with the Raspberry Pi. I like the Pi. I think I actually have 4 Raspberry Pis in my house right now, at least. So the Raspberry Pi is cheaper than if you were to go out and purchase a PC. But you can do a whole lot more, much faster with, say, an Intel i5 CPU that's in the Dell Optiplexes than you can with the Pi processor. The Optiplex is also upgradable. If the server needs more than 8 gigabytes of memory, an Optiplex 3010 can easily and inexpensively be upgraded to 16 gigabytes. It's got 2 slots for memory, and each slot can take up to 8 gigabytes of memory. So the Optiplex 3010 can go to 16 gigabytes. If you have the Optiplex 7010, that has 4 memory slots, and you can go to 32 gigs. So, and of course, other similar models will have similar memory upgrade capabilities. The Pi can be purchased with up to 8 gigabytes of memory right now, but that is the most expensive model, and it's not upgradable. It's soldered right to the board. There's no slots that you can upgrade for the future. So if for some reason your server application needs more than 8 gigabytes of memory, and most home applications won't. The workstation that I'm currently recording this video on has 64 gigs of memory and can be upgraded to 128. Do I need that much memory? No, but it's nice to have. So same thing with the server environment. You might not need more than 8 gigabytes of memory when you start out your service, but it sure be nice to be able to upgrade to 16 gigabytes later on if the need for more memory arose. So that's another advantage of going with the PC route, like a Dell Optiplex, instead of the Raspberry Pi. So I do already have the Dell Optiplex machines, so that's a consideration. I don't have to go out and purchase them. But most any PC could stand in for the Optiplex. If you have some older desktop PC that's just been sitting around or not getting much use, or it's been, retired and sitting in a corner or down in the basements or wherever it may be, you can pull it out, do a few upgrades on it, check it out, and then use it as a home server. It's a very frequent use for old PCs, or it should be, that we can continue to use these to get useful things done. So one of my goals is to show that an old PC may be better than a single board computer, like the Pi, both for learning. You can do tons of things with coding, servers, and that sort of thing, and capability. So you can do a lot more with the processing and upgrades and things you can connect, etc., than you can with the Pi. There's a lot of similarities. But I guess this is especially true if you already have the PC. So if you already have a PC that's a spare one, well, that's going to be cheaper than if you have to go buy a Raspberry Pi. So kind of my perspective and background, local computer repair and sales accounts for most of my business. So I already have many years of experience with the PC platform, extremely comfortable with it. And so something like the Dell Optiplex, I've worked on so many of those. I've sold so many. I know them very well. So that's a point of comfort. If anything goes wrong, I know how to quickly address it. And so that's something as well to consider for me in my experience. And I'm also selling computers through my online store, retroedge.tech, retroedgetech.com is my store, and retroedge.tech is the website that I'm showing you now with my post. And right now, the only computer that I have up for sale, there'll be more later, is actually the Dell Optiplex 3010. So the same computers that I'm going to be using for my project of having Alpine Linux separated out for these different servers for my home work environments, office, workshop, etc., is going to be essentially 3 or 4 of these stacked on top of each other. And yes, I will be selling them. So that is part of my business. That's what I do, is repair and sell computers. And so most of that is local right now, but I'm expanding and starting to sell online, which is that's exactly what that is. So I like the Raspberry Pi and other single board computers. I'm glad they're an option. The Pi was designed to be an educational option for people who may not be able to get their own PC. If you already have access to a cheaper free PC, the PC is often the better choice. That's the arguments I'm presenting, and thank you for considering it. So this is a big encouragement to say, if you have a spare PC and you're wanting to learn something new, you can install Linux on it. You can experiment with different server software. You can start to do programming. You can write scripts that talk to different machines if you want to get into networking or services. There's so much that you can do with a PC that might just be lying around. It's a resource that you might not know that you had, in the sense of, oh, I need to get a special kind of trendy computer or something for learning, or a single board computer, because that's what's hot right now. And my argument is you can do a lot with the PC that you already have, especially if it's a spare one, because then you can experiment with hardware upgrades, different configurations, different operating systems, server software, all kinds of things. So PCs are a great platform. I think that they have an excellent future, and that even though these machines may be old, that they're still very useful for learning and actual use. The Dell Optiplexes that I'm using, I'm not exactly sure how old they are, but I believe they have Intel i5 third generation processors. So my guess is that they're at least 7 years old. And by a lot of people's computer standards, they say, oh, that's old. I have a lot of customers that when they call and talk to me about their computer they repair, I think I had someone today actually who said on the phone to me, well, my computer's about 4 years old, so I know it's a little bit old. And I told her over the phone that almost all of the hardware that I'm using in my professional work is probably about 8 years old, and I'm very happy with it. So depending on the computer, it may very well be worth continuing to use it and upgrade it and get the most out of it, instead of buying something new just because it's newer. So I'm sure that I'll talk a lot more about that topic in coming videos, but that's what I wanted to get across today, is pitting the Dell Optiplex versus the Raspberry Pi. And for my project of splitting out services to 4 different separate machines and the services that I need, the Dell Optiplex will be a better solution for me than the Raspberry Pi. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.